Our next guest is Professor Andrew Wilson. Andrew is chair of the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, or PBAC, which is the independent expert body established to make recommendations and give advice to the Minister about which drugs should be listed on the PBS. Very easy job Andrew has there. Andrew is also co-director of the Menzies Centre for Health Policy and Economics at the University of Sydney and co-leads the Australian Prevention Partnership Centre. He'll be speaking to us today about the challenges of measuring value. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you. A task made even harder by that very touching story that we've heard, and I hope that I'll reflect on some of those elements in what I have to say today. You know, if you, those of you who've seen me talk on occasions know that sometimes I sort of just talk to a PowerPoint and I've got no other notes that are there. And on some rare occasions I actually have something which I've written down and in detail in relation to it. And this usually occurs when I think the issues are complex, when I need to think about them and I need to be clear about what I say in writing it. So hopefully I've been clear in what I'm going to say today in relation to some of these things. So let me start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands in which we gather today, the Ngunnawal people, and to acknowledge their elders past, present and future. Thank you Rare Cancers Australia and Canteen for organising this forum and inviting me, and I'd like to acknowledge the excellent work of both organisations. I've had the privilege of participating as a member on the advisory committee to Canteen and meeting some of the committed young people who enrich that organisation. Thank you also to those people with cancer who have shared their stories, just like we've heard today, and the challenges that they face, particularly those with rare cancers, and I'm certainly not denying those challenges. In the discussion to prepare for this session, Richard Vine asked me if I wanted to not wear my hat as the chair of the PBAC. Now, I know Richard was helpfully trying to allow me to separate my personal views from those that I feel I need to express as the chair of the PBAC. However, when you are the chair of a committee like the PBAC, this distinction is fine in principle, but in reality, what I say will at the very least be taken as the view of the PBAC, if not some reflection of government policy. Given we are meeting in Parliament House, it's important that I clarify that what I say today doesn't necessarily reflect the views of government, and certainly not the Minister of Health and Aged Care, who's barely had time to come to grips with the size of the budget requests that the PBAC makes at every meeting, let alone the detailed nuances of how our decisions are made. I confess up front that I have struggled with what I would have to say today on this topic, the challenge of measuring value. Sometimes when a concept is fundamental to the work that you do, you don't spend a lot of time reflecting on the what and why. And the PBAC work is about the relative value offered by medicines. In doing so, we have adopted some standard metrics, including things like the quality adjusted life year, as a way of achieving consistency in comparisons and in the decisions that flow from our assessments. I'll return to that a bit later in my presentation. So I thought it might be useful today, for today's discussion, to talk about the context of PBAC decision making. What underpins the way we make decisions? Now, any committee charged with making recommendations to government on funding does so within a framework. That framework is determined by policy parameters of the government of the day, rules or guidelines which may be externally or internally set, and in the case of PBAC, legislative requirements. None of these are written in stone. They can be changed and are changed, and I'm sure will be changed. Our current framework for practical purposes is largely set out in the guidelines for preparing a submission to the PBAC version 5. So at the very least, it's been reviewed on at least 4 previous occasions since its inception. I'm expecting, following the HTA policy review and incorporating any relevant government responses to the recommendations of the House of Representatives Committee Inquiry into Access into Medicines, try saying that one quickly, there will be further changes. In making decisions, the PBAC is obliged to stay within the parameters of that framework. Sometimes this is because we legally can't make decisions outside of that scope. For example, the PBAC makes recommendations for listing on the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme. It can't make recommendations for listing on the Medical Benefit Scheme. except in very limited circumstances, it can't recommend a medicine to be listed on the PBS if its use will be primarily for patients in hospital. It doesn't make recommendations for listing on the life-saving drugs program, although it does have to advise that such medicines are not cost-effective. Now, this can be very frustrating for the committee because sometimes the PBS may not be the best mechanism to provide the sorts of accesses that we're talking about today. We raised the desirability of having more flexibility on recommending how medicines were funded with that House of Representatives Committee inquiry. Another reason we stay within the framework is about trying to ensure consistency in decision-making and fairness to different applicants and more broadly to the different patient populations who will benefit from the public subsidy that comes with PBS listing. It's important to me, at least, that we try for fairness according to patient needs. I think public and political support for the PBS would be seriously damaged if we were seen to be advantaging one group of patients over another. Of course, in practice, we see a lot more medicines for conditions like cancers than we do, for example, for very debilitating neurological diseases. I'm very well aware that there are patient groups who feel that we don't treat them equally to, say, patients with cancers. And as we just heard, even within that, in the cancer community, people who feel they're at a disadvantage compared to those, to the more common cancers. Now, in the way we practice, I don't believe that that's true, but I'm aware of that concern and would hope that we can find ways of addressing those concerns and reassuring people that we do aim for fairness and equity in relation to these things. Another issue is that sometimes there are differences in the speed at which evidence is generated of the benefits and harms of a treatment for a common cancer. So that evidence may come faster for common cancers and be more convincing for more common cancers than for rare cancers. I think this is a matter which will be the subject to the scrutiny in the HTA policy review, both the issues of expediency, but also the way that we look at that evidence for the purposes of making those judgments. Now, what does this long-winded introduction have to do with the question posed of me today, the challenges of measuring value? There are, of course, many different perspectives on what constitutes value. The value we are primarily focused on here is the value to people with cancer and their families and some elements of the societal value. But there are other perspectives that impact. There is the value determined by the medicine sponsor company and their shareholders. There is a value from a public perspective in terms of how public funds are spent. Is it the best use of public funds test? And in terms of the broader benefits documented in the report released today, counting the costs, the true value of investing in cancer treatment documents. These are all valid perspectives. So which, when and how does the PBAC take these into account? What guides us in this? So in thinking about this, a logical place to try and find some guidance would be in the Act that covers the PBS and the PBAC. The National Health Act 1953 and its many subsequent updates is an act actually relating to the provision of pharmaceutical, sickness and hospital benefits and of medical and dental services. In effect, it empowers the Minister on behalf of the Commonwealth to arrange for the supply by the Commonwealth of such medical or surgical aids as prescribed to persons who require them. It empowers the Minister to impose conditions as the Minister sees fit on the use or possession or access, and it covers the operation of the PBS, who can be paid for what and when, and it sets out the membership of different committees, including the PBAC. In fact, my favourite clause in the Act is section 100C, which relates to the termination of appointment of people to the PBAC, which states, a member of the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee holds office during the Minister's pleasure. Now, I've never dared even contemplate what a Minister's pleasure is for the purposes of that. The Act contains a large amount of materials which relate to the conditions of supply and to patient eligibility. But in fact, it says very little about what therapies can be covered, what the intent of listing or funding of medicines, nothing about patient need, nothing about public benefit or value. It is an act to give powers, but on and when those powers should be used, it is strangely silent. As close as the Act gets to saying anything specifically about value, and importantly, sections specifically directed at the PBAC decision-making are also in that section 100. It says, in essence, the PBAC shall make recommendations to the Minister from time to time as to the drugs and medicinal preparations which it considers should be made available as pharmaceutical benefits. But it goes on to say, for the purposes of deciding whether to recommend to the Minister that a drug or a medicinal preparation or class of drugs or medicinal preparations to be made available as a benefit under this part of the committee shall give consideration to the effectiveness and cost of the therapy involving the use of the drug, including by comparing the effectiveness and cost of the therapy with that of alternative therapies, whether or not involving the use of other drugs or preparation. Furthermore, and critically, it goes on to say, where therapy involving the use of a particular drug or medicinal preparation is substantially more costly than alternative therapy or alternative therapies, the committee shall not recommend to the Minister that the drug, preparation or class be made available as a pharmaceutical benefit under this part unless the committee is satisfied that the first mentioned therapy for some patients provides a significant improvement in efficacy and a reduction of toxicity over the alternative therapy. So, my apologies for reading that out in full, but it is an important and legislated requirement that the PBAC has to consider. These clauses require a test that the PBAC must make in our decision making, but it specifies no values or metrics that constitute a correct answer. Now, I think this is deliberate. I think governments wanted to give the PBAC leeway to respond to different needs, and we do. We don't have a fixed decision point, and we have a point of reference for our decisions about incremental cost effectiveness, but there are many medicines listed with higher cost per quality adjusted life year than the reference point. Those are frequently for diseases which are less common in relation to that. So now back to my search. Where does the PBAC find guidance on these matters? Going hand in hand with most legislation, there will usually be a policy that sets out the intent of the legislation. But the policy can be much broader than the legislation, and policy settings can change even when there is no change to the legislation. Policy set out the values of the government of the day, but policies don't have to change from government to government. And sometimes governments just impose new nuances on existing policies. For example, the previous government made a commitment to fund all positive decisions of the PBAC. Now, the only medicine-specific policy is the National Medicines Policy. Now, at this point, I'm hoping some listening will say to themselves, oh, so that's why Wilson has been banging on about the need to review the National Medicines Policy ever since he became chair, and why he would argue that the review needs to be complete before we do the HTA policy review. The policy is where we find, or should find, the broader parameters about what we are trying to achieve with the PBS. It represented a consensus view of many stakeholders endorsed by governments over 2 decades about what we were trying to achieve in facilitating and subsidising access to medicines. If you read between the lines, it talks about fairness in access, affordability, benefits and values. It helps determine the broader framework that guides the PBA's decision making. The consultation and debate occurring as part of the current review of the National Medicines Policy, I think, is healthy. There are many things that we may want to change in relation to that, or many things that we may want to be more specific in the National Medicines Policy, or we may choose to leave it as a relative general statement and allow and expect that the HTA policy review picks up and specifies those. One element, for example, that I've picked up is the desire from many stakeholders to be more specific about some of the elements of value, and of course the issue of timeliness of access. Of course, there are other government policies and legislations that are also influential. Decisions of agencies like Finance and Treasury may set whole of government parameters that influencing funding parameters. Legislation like that on discrimination are relevant, and policies such as closing the gap on inequities experienced by our First Nations people are also important. In considering medicines for listing on the PBS, the PBAC is largely dependent on receiving an application from a sponsor, usually a company, but it can be other interested parties. As an aside, it is a limitation which the PBAC has identified and that suggested should be changed to allow more flexibility in some specific situations. And I think the sorts of situations we're talking about are those aspects, for example, of rare cancers, or more commonly, or one of the more common situations we have, which is access to medicines for paediatric populations. Not many medicines are fully trialled for paediatric populations, and companies do not feel they can apply for listing for these populations if it's not been approved by the TGA. It is desirable that the PBAC be explicitly given some leeway to make such listings without having to resort to making them unrestricted and without potentially and having a mechanism which can self-generate applications for consideration. Now, the PBA submission guidelines were developed to assist sponsors in making applications to provide information needed for our decision making. I'm not going to go through all the different elements of that lengthy document, but in effect, it's become a tool that has translated the requirements of the Act, the values of the National Medicines Policy, and any other requirements of us, such as those that arose from the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement in 2004. The guidelines note the principal quantitative factors that we use in our decision making, and I'm not going to reiterate those for you here today. The bit that I do want to reiterate for you is that the guidelines do identify that there are other, less readily quantifiable factors that influence our decision making, including the confidence in the evidence and assumptions relied on in the submission, equity, including age or socioeconomic or geographical status, the presence of effective therapeutic alternatives, the severity of the medical condition treated, the ability of the targeted therapy, the ability to target therapy with the proposed medicines precisely and effectively to patients likely to benefit most, public health issues like the development of resistance, and any other relevant factor that may affect the suitability of the medicine for listing on the PBS. The guidelines, as I've indicated, aim to achieve a level of consistency and quality in the submissions so that all medicines for all conditions receive an equal treatment in decision making. One of the decisions when the guidelines were first developed was, in terms of benefits and cost, to take a primary perspective from the health system rather than, say, from a broader societal perspective. Note that I said primary perspective, not necessarily the only perspective. This is because we can be much clearer, more certain on the health benefits and costs than we can beyond this. In the words of Section 3A 1.4 in the perspectives on the economic evaluation of in the guidelines, the PBAC's preferred healthcare system perspective includes, and it sets out what they are, including costs incurred by the patient, the public and private healthcare provider, and outcomes that are associated with the patient. They do not include costs and outcomes that are not specifically related to health and/or provisions of health in the base case. It goes on to talk about broader societal perspectives and how they might be brought into consideration in relation to this. It talks about supplementary analyses which may be appropriate where the proposed intervention has important societal implications extending beyond the health outcomes of the patient receiving the medicine and beyond the healthcare system. So, for example, cost savings or socially relevant outcomes in domains such as education, housing or justice or economic productivity impacts. So within the guidelines, there is the capacity for PBAC to look at these other perspectives as part of that. How many times do we see it? Not very often. Why is that? Probably because people read the first bit about our preferred perspective and assume that that means we don't place any emphasis on the second part, and it's just not true. We do take that into account, those broader aspects, when we make our decisions. Now, and we have done that, for example, in impacts on school outcomes from the treatment of attention deficit disorder or carer harms for the people with dementia. So these are important considerations in our formulation of the value proposition. What it doesn't usually do as a primary consideration is incorporate these benefits and costs in looking at the incremental cost effectiveness. So why is that and does it matter? The point of the incremental cost effectiveness is to understand the additional benefits versus harms from a new treatment over a comparator treatment or usual care, which may include no treatment. Our position is that this is usually best reflected in the clinical trial data, and that those clinical trials rarely contain information on these broader benefits. The broader benefits are usually assumed and modelled or gathered from separate observational data. So we clearly see these extended benefits, just that in judging the incremental value, they are less certain and potentially less redeemable where the argument is cost saving. Moreover, governments budget in buckets. They allocate a certain amount to health, education, defence and all other portfolios. So in judging the relative value of an expenditure, it usually occurs within portfolios, not across portfolios. And even within portfolios, it can be challenging. For example, is the best value achieved in investing in more bariatric surgery or in medicines for weight reduction or in prevention of obesity? In cancer, we see the same sort of potential spread across those different investments. Now, you might reasonably say, and all of these are important, and I would agree, but unfortunately, at the end of the budget day, they all come from the same bucket. There are also some practical considerations. In principle, I have no issue with the incorporation of broader benefits more formally into PBAC decision-making. Providing it is applied universally to all applications. Multi-criteria decision-making or analysis is one tool proposed for this. It's a bit clunky and it's still relatively underdeveloped in the health space, but it is an option. And it may have an advantage in making more transparent consideration of some of those broader benefits and harms, and that's not a bad thing, the transparency. However, what is not clear to me is how it would make a difference to our decision-making. There is now close to 30 years of PBAC decision-making around listings based on this current framework. As I've talked you through, we are required by legislation to make assessments based on comparative effectiveness, safety and costs. It's not evident to me that the incorporation of these broader values will necessarily alter the relative value, and in order to maintain a consistency of decision-making, how we could adjust those past decisions to ensure comparative relativity. Without that, we could end up in a position of shifting the goalposts where government are paid more for medicines without any real gains. Another adage that you will have repeatedly heard from me when I talk, it is very difficult to change one element of a decision-making framework without potential unintended effects. This is not an argument not to make changes and not to change elements. It is stating that when we make these changes, we need to make sure that we take it a whole of system, a whole of decision framework perspective on it. I noted earlier one of the challenges of listing medicines for paediatric patients when they're not under TGA approved. Another challenge for us in relation to adolescents and young persons is that cancer is by its nature much more common in older persons. So, for example, the youngest median age of patients in trials for the 10 cancer missions for November meeting this year is 51 years, and 80% of them were above 60 years. So younger patients are not well represented in trials. However, it is also the case that the PBAC has accepted incremental cost-effectiveness medicines for cancers and rarer cancers, for cancers where younger people are more represented, and for rarer cancers. In closing, I hope you will take away that the decisions of the PBAC are heavily influenced by formal health technology assessment, but the factors it considers are not confined to that HTA inputs. It is true that we have to consider both the relative cost effectiveness and the total costs of medicine in our deliberations. But let there be no doubt that the first question that PBAC seeks to clarify in its deliberations is the need for the new medicine. That need is a consideration of the nature of the illness, its impact on patients, the number of people affected by the illness or condition, and how they are affected by it. Sometimes this is pretty well known to us, but other times not so clear. And that's why we prioritise to find out more from patients about about the impacts on their families and from their relevant specialists. We consider, in a general way, the availability of existing treatments and how well those treatment works and the impacts of those treatments on patients. and we do consider those broader benefits, many of which for patients with cancer are nicely illustrated in the report counting the costs being released today. However, how it changes decision making is much less clear to me, and I look forward to that discussion. Thank you very much.